Okay, we're going to get going. Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Adam Greco, and I work for Search Discovery, and I will be conducting our session on Adobe Analytics metrics today. For those of you who I haven't met, just a little background on me. I was one of the early employees at Omniture, helped kind of grow the consulting practice way back when. I've been around Adobe Analytics for about 20 years. I've been consulting on the product, wrote the book on the product, wrote a lot of blog posts. So spent a lot of time dealing with Adobe Analytics. And I currently work on a new Adobe product that we're making at Search Discovery called Apollo. So this is the second Adobe session that we've had. Hopefully you all were able to listen into the first one either live or check it out in the Slack group. The SDEC is a free analytics initiative that we're doing to try to help people who are either out of work right now or looking to learn more, shift jobs, get promoted, whatever your reason. We've got 10 categories of topics that we're focused on. Right now, we're doing a little more in the Adobe area just because it takes me a little time to get speakers in some of the other areas, and I can do the Adobe ones on my own. If you currently are not getting invites for certain topics that you'd like to come to meetings for, you can DM me in Slack, and I can verify that you signed up for the right things when you initially joined the SDEC. We have been growing gangbusters. Yesterday I posted in the Slack group a map of where our members are. So we definitely see some regions that are popping up. We definitely have regions we'd like to grow, like South America, some more in Australia and Asia, and Africa. But if you know people who want to join, we'd love to add more pins to this map. Right now, we are at 1,600, almost 1,700 members in 60 countries, almost 600 cities. And right now in the Adobe channel, we have already 1,300 folks. So pretty cool. If you know other people who would benefit from learning more for free about Adobe Analytics or other topics, there is a link here, bit.ly SDI-SDEC. One thing that would really help us to help you, if you can join the Slack group, that really does help. We're starting to see some issues with email. Right now, we have about 73% of the folks in the Slack group. We're probably going to slowly move to more communication happening via Slack than email. When you join Slack, it does help if you make your username and display name your full name, because we have a lot of people with the same name. We have a lot of Stephanies and Rachels. So helps us to understand, kind of make sure you get into the right topics. And until we cut off email, the two email addresses that'd be great to add to your contacts are SDEC@searchdiscovery.com and no-reply@zoom.us to make sure you're getting things. If your organization does block Zoom, but you still want to attend live, DM me. There's a way we can get you an alternative way to view the webinars live. And if you're getting too many emails, just DM me as well, and I can remove you from some of the emails. Some upcoming webinars that we do have after today. Later this week, we're going to have a visualization topic with Brent Dykes talking about storytelling. I'm going to be doing another Adobe session next week, and then we have a bunch of other ones listed here. If you want to see when the sessions are and have a little reminder in your calendar, we do have an SDEC calendar that you can join. It's just a Google Calendar you could subscribe to. I just put the link in the chat if you don't already have that. It's pinned in the SDEC group, but a nice way to just kind of see when we have events. And then lastly, during the webinar today, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A area of Zoom. If you do it in the chat, that doesn't help us. But if you do it in the Q&A, I'll get to as many of those as I can at the end. And the webinar will be recorded. So if I go too quickly or there's stuff you want to review later, this will be posted in Slack later. So with that, let's get into Adobe Analytics metrics. So as you probably have noticed in the first two sessions, I am going to kind of start these educations around Adobe being a little more basic. There's a lot of people who are new to Adobe Analytics who are in the SDEC. So I'm going to basically start from the beginning. I started with report suites last time. Today I'm going to talk about metrics. I will try to include some stuff. So if you're a little more advanced, there is some stuff that you might get some value from. But please be patient, some of the more advanced folks, because I want to get everyone up to speed. And then as we go on throughout the year, we'll definitely get to some more advanced Adobe Analytics topics. But today we're going to talk about metrics. So in Adobe Analytics, there are several different types of metrics. I kind of think of them in 4 different buckets. There's the out-of-the-box metrics that you get just by putting on your JavaScript code on your site. You've got success events, you've got calculated metrics, and derived metrics. So I'm going to cover each of these in different sections just to make sure we're all on the same page with how we think of metrics in Adobe Analytics. So let's start with the most basic, the out-of-the-box metrics. So these are metrics that are basically provided by default in every implementation. The minute that you put code on your site, you kind of can't avoid having these metrics. And they're things like page views, visits, unique visitors, things like exits, entries, and then time spent and so on. So here I'm just showing a very simple date report where you're looking at a couple out of the box metrics like page views and unique visitors. I did also include a QR code up at the top right. So if you pause this when you're watching the recording, if you point your phone at that, that will actually take you to a nice help document in Adobe that shows you every single out of the box metrics. There was too many to show here, and it has all of their definitions. But these are ones that you can definitely get started with before you customize your implementation. And these are ones that are great to use for training because every one of your users in every report suite will have these metrics. Now, one of the things that confuses people, especially newbies to Adobe Analytics, is there are some metrics that you'll see that are called occurrences, and then a lot of your dimensions will have this thing called instances. And this really throws people because they're like, what's the difference between an occurrence and an instance? So I'm showing 2 different examples here, but in general, occurrences are basically how often was a value passed to a dimension, and that could be either an EBAR or an SPROP. And then the occurrence will also count each time that that value persisted. And that persistence really only applies to EVARs because SPROPs or traffic variables don't persist. So when I say persistence, I'm meaning that a value was passed on page A, but then it was told through the settings to remember its value on page B and C and D. So whenever that value persists, it gets another occurrence. If you look at the graph here, the report on the left, I'm looking at a tracking code EVAR, and I'm looking at one particular value, and you could see that it has 313 occurrences, but only 132 instances. So that means that it actually was passed via JavaScript 132 times, but then the people who received that value clicked on other pages, and it basically got multiple occurrences. Now, if you look at the right, here we have occurrences, same report, but now we're looking at tracking code in basically an SPROP instead of an EVAR. And you should normally see that occurrences and instances are the same for SPROPs because SPROPs don't have persistence. So instances are really just a count of how often the value was passed to the dimension, and it doesn't include persistence. So these are kind of weird, funky metrics that some of your users may encounter. I don't use them all that often, but they are handy when it comes to kind of testing your implementation and QAing your data, because that's a way that you can tell is the value actually populating in your variables. So now let's move on to success events. So success events are the metrics that you choose to set within your implementation. So this is really up to you to decide what you want to as success on your website. What KPIs do you want? And success events can be set really for anything. You can make a success event when someone clicks a button. You can make it when they do a search on the site, when they click on the top nav, when they download a file, when they click to like you on LinkedIn or Facebook. Really, whatever you want can be a success event. Now, I believe all packages come with 1,000 success events these days. I can't keep track of how Adobe changes all of their contracts and packages, but I'm pretty sure all of them come with 1,000 success events plus some of the out of the box ones that like the shopping cart ones. So you do have plenty of metrics to work with, plenty of success events. Now, success events are normally set via JavaScript. They can also be imported using data sources. And in the future, I'm going to do a whole session on data sources and transaction ID, since that's a little more advanced. But basically, you get to choose where and when you want to collect data in success events. And all success events are tied to dates. So they're all stamped with the date because Adobe wants to be able to show you how many times that success event occurred on August 1st, August 2nd, August 3rd. So this is a part of your decision as an owner or a user of Adobe Analytics to decide what success events you want to set. Here, I'm showing a really basic one where I'm showing, say, internal searches or searches on a website by date. And that just happens to be every time someone does a search, I set a success event. Now, where it gets a little tricky is there are actually different types of success events. I think of these as different flavors of success events. Now, success events can be set in the admin console as one of these three different flavors, and they're either a counter, a numeric, or a currency success event. And I'm going to go through each of these in a little more detail, but an easy way to remember this is that counter success events, for the most part, just increase the metric by 1 whenever something happens. Whenever you say, hey, this success event happened, then it moves up by 1. Numeric success events basically go up by the number that is passed to it. So if you pass the number 15 or 20 or 30, then that success event will go up by 15, 20, or 30 at that one time. And then a currency success event is one in which the metric will also go up by the number passed to it, which is often more than just 1, but it also applies the currency of the report suite, that the currency that's set up with that report suite. And we talked about that in my last session, that each report suite has to have a particular currency. So if you just want to document that something happened, you just set a counter event. And in my experience, usually about 90 to 95% of your success events are going to be counter success events. Numeric is where you just want to move up by more than 1, and currency is move up by more than 1, and it has the currency of the report suite. So let's go into each of these in a little more detail and go through some examples. As I mentioned, counter success events are used most often. They indicate that something happened, such as maybe an on-site search, like the example I'm showing here, or an order took place, or a form was completed, or a product view took place, or maybe you want to track impressions of on-site banners and clicks of banners. Anytime that you just want to know that something happened, then you would set a counter success event. A numeric success event is a little trickier, and most novice folks don't really understand when to use numeric success events. Some examples here where I use numeric success events are to create averages. So if you look at the calculated metric that I'm showing here, I call it average internal search position clicked. So what I wanted to do in this implementation is every time someone does a search, if they click on, let's say I do a search and someone clicks on the 10th position, then I would actually pass the number 10 to event 17 here, which is called internal search position clicked. And every time someone does a search, if one person clicks on the 10th position, the 5th position, the 7th position, we're always passing the number of the position they clicked on to a numeric success event. And that event would then go up by either 5 or 7 or 10. Then what I did in the calculated metric is I divided it by a counter event called internal searches, which would then give me the average. So a really simple example, if someone does a search and they click on the 10th position, then the average would be 10 divided by 1. If another person clicks on the 5th position, now we have 2 searches, and the total in the numeric event would be 5 plus 10, 15, so the average position clicked would be 7.5. That's a good use of a numeric success event. Another is maybe you want to track visitor engagement on your website, and you come up with a scoring system that says every time someone looks at a product, that's 5 points. Every time someone adds a product to cart, that's 25 points, whatever you want. All of those number scores could be passed to a numeric success event, and it would just keep getting bigger and bigger, and it would update the event by the number of points or number that you pass to it. Some other uses are through data sources. Numeric success events are popular to be used with data sources. Like, let's say you want to use data sources to upload how many orders took place each day on your back end. So you've got your website orders in the orders event in Adobe Analytics, but you also want to compare that to maybe back end orders. Well, you would want to upload each day how many orders took place, and you would use a numeric success event for that. If you're a B2B company, maybe you want to know how many online accounts were opened every day. So you would upload that through data sources. Or maybe when I used to work at Salesforce.com, we would upload marketing qualified leads that took place after they had filled out a form. So these are cases where the number is going to go up by more than one, and you might want to use a numeric success event. And then finally, a currency success event is basically the money actions that happen on your site. So obviously, revenue is a currency success event. Anytime you want it to be tied to a currency. Here, I'm showing an example from an old blog post of mine where I had advised that a retailer said, you know, if you want to see how much money is being added to the shopping cart or money that makes it to checkout, and compare that to how much money is actually purchased, you might want to set two custom currency success events. Here, I have one that's called dollars added to cart, which is currency success event 101, and then I have dollars added to checkout, currency event 102. And so as someone adds a product to the cart, in addition to doing the cart add event, we're actually going to pass in the dollar amount of that product to a currency success event. And because the report suite in this case is using US dollars, it knows to basically associate that with dollars. And then here you get a nice report where you could see that 17 million in this time frame was added to cart, but only 13 million made it to checkout and 10 million was purchased. So that's a great use of a currency success event. Other uses might be, I'm a bank and I have people who are doing transactions on my website, and I want to see how much money so-and-so has transferred in from account A to account B. Well, that would be a currency success event. Maybe they're trading. Maybe you're E-Trade or Charles Schwab and people are trading on the site and you want to see how much is traded. That might go into an amount traded currency success event. And again, you can use a currency success event for data source uploads as well. Maybe you want to take your back-end revenue to compare your online revenue to your back-end revenue. Or maybe for every product that's purchased, you want to upload into a currency success event the actual cost of that product so you could see what your net margin is. Great uses of currency success events. Now, one little kind of warning I'll give you with currency success events is, as we talked about in the last session, every report suite has a set currency for that report suite. This can get confusing if you have a website that can deal with multiple currencies. And so I wanted to explain that currency success events will always translate the currency of any currency success event that doesn't match the report suite using an exchange rate from a website called xe.com. And this can be a little confusing, so let me give you an example. Let's say that you have a currency success event for mortgage amount requested in a loan calculator like I'm showing in the middle of the screen here. But let's say you're a European site and you're on a German website, so the report suite is set in euros. But someone using the calculator is looking for a loan, and for some crazy reason, they've chosen, as I'm showing here, that they want to look at it in British pounds. So when they hit calculate now, what would happen is that your developer would pass that the currency code is British pounds as shown in the s.currency code here. Then it would be, in this case, maybe 200,000 pounds. But since that data is going into a German report suite that is set to euros, what a currency success event will do is it will translate the pounds to euros using whatever's the current exchange rate on xe.com so that you don't end up mixing euros and pounds. Now, obviously, if that server call was multi-suite tagged and also went to a British report suite, then in that case, it would leave it alone. It would be 200,000 pounds there, but in the German report suite, it would be translated into euros. So just something to keep in mind, and that's one of the advantages of using a currency success event instead of just using maybe like a numeric success event, which doesn't have any capabilities when it comes to currency translation. So that's basically it on success events. So now let's move into calculated metrics. So calculated metrics basically use metrics, dimensions, segments, and functions to create new formulaic metrics that are basically just created out of thin air. So this is just like you would do with a formula in Microsoft Excel. You define what you want the formula to be, and then you add it to your implementation, and it then acts like any other metric in Adobe Analytics. So here I'm showing an example where I have two standard metrics. I've got revenue and orders, but I've created an average order value calculated metric, which just divides revenue by orders. Other examples might be orders per visit for maybe an order conversion rate, or form completion rate, which is your form completes over form views, or maybe like an internal search click-through rate. So you get to determine what calculations you want, and then you can share out these calculated metrics. And there's really no limits. You can make as many as you want. Now, one other little warning I'll give you is for those of you who are administrators, there's this thing that you may notice, and a lot of people never touch it because they don't know what it is. But when you look at a metric, a success event, there's a visibility setting that I'm showing on the right. Normally, you're going to make that visible everywhere. So if you have a new success event, you want everyone to be able to see it. There is a cool option that's called builders. And what builders does is it says, this is one that I'm not going to show in the menus because it doesn't really make sense on its own, but it is cool to use in the calculated metric builder. So it could be used in a metric. So earlier I talked about that internal search position clicked, and we use that to figure out the average. Well, that's just collecting the position that was clicked, like position 5, position 10. If you actually look at that success event by its own, the number might be like 25,430 today. It really makes no sense. So I don't know why anyone would actually ever want to open up that metric by itself. It really is there just to be used in a calculated metric. So in this case, I would recommend that you set it to builders so it will show up in the calculated metric builder, but it won't show up anywhere else. And this can help avoid some end user confusion people who see metrics that they really shouldn't be using in the interface. Now, the next thing I want to talk about with calculated metrics is functions. So calculated metrics allow you to add functions to them, along with segments as well, but we're going to cover segments in a whole different session. But these functions act very much like the ones you're used to in Microsoft Excel. You might have a function for counting, or a standard deviation, or percentile, or a cumulative average. But basically, when you add a function to a calculated metric, it allows you to add metrics and dimensions to that function that will give you some new calculations that you wouldn't get otherwise. And those functions apply to basically every row in the report when that calculated metric is added to a report. So let's go through one example just to see how functions work. One of my favorite functions is called the approximate count distinct function. And so here, what you see that I've done on the left is I've dragged over that function, and the function is telling me that in order to work, I need a dimension in it. That's what it shows with the parentheses. And there's a little information icon you can click that will give you lots of help about the function. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to see an approximate count distinct, which will show me how many different or distinct values of a dimension were collected in whatever time frame I'm looking at. So if I drag in evar2 internal search term or internal search keyword, when I look at the report that's shown here, in this case, I'm looking for each month, I am seeing how many different internal search keywords were found or passed into this evar in that month. So here in April, there were 300 different terms. Now, obviously there were more than 300 searches, but there were 300 unique or distinct search terms that were used. And then in May, there were only 294, and in June, there were 347. So this kind of shows you the breadth of a particular dimension over time. On the right, I did the same thing, but in this case, instead of using internal search term, I used tracking code. So if I have a bunch of campaigns out there, if I want to know how many of my campaigns are actually being used, then I could use the approximate count distinct. And what this means is that the first time a tracking code is viewed in the month of April, it will be counted. And then all of the rest of the time, it will still be counted in reporting, but it won't be counted as a new distinct tracking code. So in this case, it's kind of depressing. In the month of April, I only have 34 different tracking codes that actually got at least one or more used. But then in May, it went up to 47 and so on. So anytime you want to see how often a thing happened, how many different values were collected, you could use this function. And again, this is just one of hundreds of functions that are available, but this is kind of a cool one that I use a lot and just a way to show you how you could use these functions in calculated metrics. The last big topic I want to talk about is derived metrics. So derived metrics is kind of a fake term that some of us in the Adobe world have made. I don't know if it's actually called that in Adobe's interface, but I always call them derived metrics. And the idea of a derived metric is when you add a segment to a calculated metric. And so there's lots of cool uses of this. Here I'm showing one example is, let's say I have a segment that I have identified a bunch of fraudulent orders. Maybe the segment says, hey, if the order is greater than $1 million, like that was a mistake, or we have a bunch of order IDs that we know are fraudulent, so we're gonna add a bunch of order IDs to a segment. Well, now I have a segment that's called order is fraudulent. And what I can do is I can add that to a calculated metric with my normal orders metric as shown here. And here what you see when you define it that I've actually nested orders within the segment order is fraudulent. And now I can make a brand new metric or a derived metric that's called fraudulent orders. And now that can be used by anyone in my implementation. They can go and just drag over fraudulent orders, and now they can take that out of reports or use that however they want. And so the concept can be used in millions of different ways. Maybe you want to say you have someone who cares about blog posts, but only for people who came from Facebook. Well, you can basically make a new calculated metric. Now, for all of these examples I'm showing here, you could just always put a metric in a report and then drag over a segment that says, like, for example, I could drag over blog post views and then drag over a segment that says, did the visit come from Facebook? But if this is something you're going to use a lot, very often, you might want to make a new derived metric that just brings together the segment and the metric, and then your users they learn to use that metric instead of always having to learn how to do segmentation. Another one, visits from retirees. Let's say you have a segment that identifies a bunch of users that are retired and maybe they're, you want to market to them differently. Well, then you could apply that segment to visits and now you've got retiree visits. Maybe you want to look at all of your internal search terms and identify any search term that is one of your product SKUs. I just want to know how often of all my internal searches are they searches for SKUs. Well, again, if you have a segment that identifies search terms that are SKUs, you could add that to the internal searches success event and you're good to go. And then lastly, maybe gold customer visits. Maybe you have a bunch of user IDs and you find a way to identify that these 1,000 user IDs, they're my gold customers. Well, you can then add that as a segment to visits and have a new metric that's called gold customer visits. So lots of cool ways you can do this, but I generally recommend using derived metrics for things that you're gonna wanna apply a segment almost every time you use that metric. Now this can get pretty crazy. This is one, I had to kind of blur this out because it came from an old client of mine, but this is basically a really complicated calculated metric. And here, since you see blue in it, you could see that it's got a segment, which means it's technically a derived metric. And I also see some black in here, so I'm using some formulas, some functions here. But this can get crazy, but Adobe Analytics can handle it. You just gotta, think it through and make sure you test, but they can get pretty complex. Now, one question I get, I'd probably say the most popular question I get from advanced Adobe Analytics customers when it comes to derived metrics, derived calculated metrics, is this. How do I know when I should just use a good old-fashioned success event for, say, a new thing I want to track, or should I use a derived metric? And I'm going to give you a little quiz here and give you an example. So I used to work at Salesforce.com, and we had a bunch of forms on our website, and we had three main types of forms. We had free trial, demo, contact us. Now, let's say that you have three form types on your website, and you want to track how often people start and complete forms. So one option is to say, you know what, I'm going to have 6 success events. I'm going to have started free trial, completed free trial, started demo, completed demo, started contact us, completed contact us. So you could have 6 success events. Or alternatively, you could have 2 success events, which is just, I want to know how many people started a form and how many people completed a form. And then I'm going to use an EVAR to document the type. Was it free trial or demo? And I'm going to make 6 derived metrics instead. So since I've been talking a while, I'm going to launch a poll right now and ask you all to vote. What would you do? Would you use 2 success events with an EVAR and then make 6 derived metrics, or would you create 6 new success events? So go ahead and vote now, and we'll see what you guys think. I'm gonna give it another 15 seconds. Okay, so let me share the results with you. So we had an 85 to 15% split for people saying, I am going the derived metric method. So what's interesting here is there isn't a right or wrong answer. There's always the, Adam, what would you do? I get a lot. But let me kind of walk you through why this is an interesting scenario. Like, both will work, but in general, I actually would have been probably with the 15%, not the 85%, and I'll tell you why. If there is a small number of options, in this case, there were only 2 success events, and there were 3 permutations. So there was a certain number of success events that it's a finite number that I could control. Since you get 1,000 success events, I probably would have gone that approach instead of using a derived metric. Now, I might have even done both, and here's why. There are 4 main gotchas of derived metrics that success events, good old-fashioned success events, kind of have an advantage over derived metrics. And I'm going to go through each of these. First of all, calculated metrics, which include derived metrics, cannot be used in fallout visualizations, which is a really important one. I use the fallout visualization a lot. They also cannot use the non-standard attribution models, including participation. They also cannot be used to build segments, which I'll show you in a second, and some other visualizations that I don't use as often, like histogram and cohort, can't use them as well. So let me kind of walk you through each of these one by one. So let's say that you're using a fallout. And in this example, I have a success event called contact requests. But you can see in the top left, I've highlighted in blue that I decided to make a really simple, boring derived metric that's called Chrome contact requests. It's basically just a contact request that someone did in a Chrome browser, just because it's easy. If I tried to drag that over to a fallout report, it won't work. It grays out the whole visualization because you can't add a calculated metric to a fallout. Now, if I would have had a success event that was called contact requests, and I set a different success event when they were on Chrome, or in the example I gave earlier, like a free trial form start, free trial form complete, I could have put any of those into a fallout report because they're not a calculated metric. Another thing I mentioned earlier is here on the left, you could see that event 11 is my contact request completed. But the minute I add a Chrome contact request completed using a derived metric, suddenly the used non-default attribution model at the bottom there on the right is grayed out. You can't use it. So just part of the way the product is built. If you're building a segment, you could build a segment that says, I want to look at a success event like contact request completed where it equals 1, equals 2, or is greater than 3. Again, you can't even drag over a derived metric in that case. if you want to build a segment. So you can't do it there. And then, as I mentioned, some other visualizations that I use, histogram, you can't use with the derived metric, and a cohort table, you can't use with the derived metric. So there's lots of ways you can work around this, but in general, you're going to be fine if you use derived metrics 95% of the time. But if I would have had 20 forms, 20 different types on my website, I probably would have definitely gone with the derived metric approach. But in this case, since I only had 3 form types, I might have sucked it up and done 6 success events and been done with it. So just something to think about. So that's basically all I really wanted to cover around metrics, calculated metrics, derived metrics, and so on. So I hope that for those of you who are a little more advanced, there was maybe something in there for you. For those of you who are just kind of getting into Adobe Analytics, I hope this was helpful for you to be able to kind of start to understand how Adobe uses metrics. So I don't have anyone helping me here today, so I haven't been able to kind of moderate yet, so I'm going to switch to moderation mode. If you have a question and you've put it in the chat, please put it in the Q&A, because otherwise we don't get to see it. But if you have questions on anything I shared now, go ahead and post them in the Q&A, and I will get through as many as I can right now. So I'm doing these really cold. First question. Someone had said, thanks so much for the clear explanation on instances, occurrences, plus examples given. They were worth the listening in today. Okay, cool. That's good to hear. That's an easy question. Next one. If we have a serialized counter event, if the unique ID is the same, but the device type is different, there will be multiple counter for that one ID. Okay, so I am going to cover event serialization in another session. But just briefly, what serialization is a way that you can deduplicate success events to make sure that if they hit the back button or hit refresh, it doesn't count multiple times. I didn't have time to squeeze it into the session here today, so I'll probably cover that in a separate topic, and I'll answer a little bit more there when in the written Q&A. Next one. Calculated metrics don't work for data warehouse requests either. Yes, that is correct. So that's another kind of downside. Good call out, Jonas. I forgot to mention that one. So the good news is when you take a data warehouse report, you can always push it to Excel and you can basically recreate it. But that is a good point, another thing to think about. Someone had asked if we could give demo access to Adobe Analytics. Unfortunately, that's not my call. That's an Adobe thing. So there is a free version of Adobe Analytics you can get into that has to do with, I think, basketball and the March Madness stuff. But unfortunately, that's out of my control. Next one. Since calculated metrics are not available for foundation version, is there an alternative to that? So I am not familiar with some of the new things Adobe's doing with their packages. I tend to work with larger clients. I would be surprised, that sounds very surprising to me, that calculated metrics are not available in the foundation. So I'm gonna do some research on that, and maybe you just don't have access to create a calculated metric, because there is a security setting where only people with the right security can create calculated metrics. So I'm gonna have to double check with Adobe on that. Next one, what is plurality and participation in success event setup? So polarity is a setting in the admin console for success events where you basically say, is going up, if this number goes up, is that good or is that bad? And so, for example, if you had a success event called internal searches, maybe you think that's good that people are searching on your website. Orders would probably be good. But if you had a success event that's called website errors, well, and that's kind of, I don't even like calling that a success event because it's kind of an oxymoron, but that would be one where you would change the polarity, where you say, if this is going up, then that's really bad. Participation is something that we're going to talk about in a subsequent session when we talk about all of the different attribution models that come. So I'm going to wait to cover that in a topic going forward. Can we use EVAR to store revenue instead of currency success event? What are the advantages of both and options? So there is a reason to store revenue in an EVAR, but I'm going to hold off on that question because the next session I'm doing next week is going to be on dimensions. So I think that that would be better once I've covered dimensions to go into that. So Janath, if you can do me a favor and remind me of that question when we get into the dimension topic, I think it's going to be too confusing to answer that here without having covered dimensions first. Damon had asked, if you use a derived metric, you cannot use attribution IQ on the derived event. Is correct. So that is my understanding, is that you cannot use the attribution IQ on anything related to a derived metric. Again, if anyone knows better than me, feel free to post that there. Next one, what's the most common success metric that companies miss out on that you think is valuable? So that's kind of a trick question. It really depends on your website because success events are different on every website. So there's not a right or wrong answer. One of the ones that I tend to think that people miss out on a lot is one that I showed in this session in a retail context, is how much money was added to cart. But that same concept could be applied in lots of different ways. Let's say that you're an insurance company and you have a 5-step process that people go through, and you're setting a bunch of different success events as they make it through the binding process of step 1, step 2, step 3. Well, maybe when they make it to step 3 and you know that the policy is worth, $500 a year for you, maybe passing that in to a currency success event would be really valuable. So you could go to your bosses and say, here's how much money made it to step 3 of the process, and here's how much money we bound. And I think that could be applied to everything, almost any vertical. Let's say you're an airline. You could see how much money made it to the point where they were about to book their seats and then maybe they canceled. So you could see how much money was potentially lost there, or maybe a hotel, they picked their room, but they didn't book. So I think there's a lot of things in there. But I think if you tell me the vertical you're in, I'm more than happy to kind of give you examples of some vertical ones. And maybe we'll do a session in the future of kind of top KPIs for each vertical. Someone said here, following your example, if you have 3 forms today, but may have 30 in the short to mid-term, would that be an argument in favor of a derived metric? So yeah, that's what I was mentioning. If you have a lot of different forms, like maybe there's different flavors of each form that you're doing tests on, then I probably would skew a little more to the derived metric and just keep in mind some of the downsides. I definitely, if you were going to go that path and use a derived metric, I would still have a success event for, you'd obviously have the success event for form starts and form completes, which then you could use that to be a total for all of the different permutations. But yeah, if you have thousands of things, then you're going to have to go the derived metric route. Next one, same with your last example. How would you handle tracking for each area of a specific form if you want to know where they fall out? Is it best practice to place events for important part of the form? So I don't want to turn this too much into a form tracking session, but in this case, if you wanted to know where people fell out during a form, I would probably use custom links and set an SPROP with the form name and then concatenate the field they were in last, and then do a fallout report, and maybe just turn that on only when you're doing form testing, because otherwise the server calls will really blow out your contract. I probably wouldn't set a success event at every single field, but if you're using a single page app, maybe you set a success event when they start, and maybe when they get 50% of the way through, and then 75% through, and then maybe 100% through. That would totally be fine as well. Really up to you. Someone said here, I am able to drag values metrics in a pivot table to either rows or columns. I've tried in Adobe Analytics, switching dimensions and metrics not optimal. Also, A can only show 5 columns. Is that true? So I'm not sure which method you're using. So that one, I might have you, whoever asked that question, maybe DM me in Slack, because I'm not sure if you're using Analysis Workspace, or you might be using the report builder. So I'm going to take that one offline. So whoever anonymously asked that question, just DM me in Slack and we'll see if we can figure that out. Next one, can bounce rate metric be analyzed against EBARs? Is it useful only against pages only? Yes, the bounce rate can be used against any dimension. There are some gotchas, and Ben Gaines has a really good blog post that I'll see if I can put a link to when I do the written answers, because the way persistence works, its bounce rate's a little bit different with EVARs because it always remembers the last value from the last visit. I tend to find more success doing bounce rates with SPROPs just because they're a little bit easier to understand. But I'll send a link there in the written responses. Again, someone asked another question about polarity. They haven't set up polarity for success events. Again, I haven't seen many benefits of that in Adobe Analytics. It's there, and I would recommend setting it. I don't know where it actually shows up at the interface, the benefit, and that might be something that maybe Jen Lasser or Eric Matisoff could answer in an upcoming session. Maybe it's there because they are planning on using that. I think it might be used behind the scenes for some of the attribution modeling. So that one I'm not 100% sure of why it's in there, but I figure as long as it's there, there's probably a reason, so go ahead and set it. Okay, last couple ones, and then I'll let you all go. What should be the custom metric strategy while running A/B tests? That one I think is too long of a topic. I think I will have to come back to that one. And then last one, when is it good to implement your own success metric to double against an out of the box, like exits don't appear in certain consistencies? So that's a good question. I don't have a rule of thumb on that. I generally have always set like a page views custom event just because I want to make sure I can control it and I can do things and not be limited to any out of the box. Over the last couple of years, Adobe has done a good job of really making sure that all the out of the box metrics act like success events. But I tend to do things like file downloads. Exits and entries is a little bit harder, but if you have certain use cases, you might actually want to set custom success events. It doesn't really hurt anything to do that. So we're kind of at our time. Thank you so much for joining. I hope this was helpful. I will put a recording of this presentation in the Adobe Analytics channel, and I'll be following up next week with the complimentary one on dimensions. If you have any questions, you can feel free to DM me in the Slack group, or you could email me at the 2 email addresses shown here. So thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you again at another SDEC session.